get the issue that polar bears need a place to live. And yet you get these politicians in the States and actually, I hate to say it, in Canada and other countries around the world that refuse to sort of even get past the point that the climate is warming, or they come up with some fanciful sorts of point like, well, polar bears will just adapt. Why won't they just adapt? And of course, we don't see undoing millions of years of evolution in sort of periods of decades. It just doesn't work like that. So there is sort of occasional sort of poke in the eye to some of these deniers in the context of, Twitter's a good way to get a message out and to reach other people. I try to stay to the polar bear science for the most part, but every so often I must confess my frustration just kind of burbles over and I just, say, look, this is what it's like. And it's not that hard to follow. But nonetheless, information isn't necessarily what changes people's minds.
Absolutely. And also argument that what you were touching on before. I mean, I can't think of a time where my mind has been changed just from argument alone without new information being shown, or if that works for anybody. But you sort of touched on the point that kind of needs to happen with working with the kids and they just get it. Maybe the next generation automatically can kind of get it because they didn't have that transaction period, and they have the inspiration where you talk to them early. Do you feel that when you talk to that generation?
Yeah, I think we all grow up with that sort of wonderment of the natural world. And then I think we sort of lose it as we get a bit older. And I think probably more and more, a lot of people are losing that with an urban lifestyle and spending less time outdoors as kids. And I think that there is hope for the next generation understanding the problem more fully because, I mean, the science curriculum has it here in Canada and most countries discuss it in a rational way now. So it's a little bit of a transition. The problem I think we've got is it's basically the older generations that need to pay the price for what's been done. And of course, they're largely unwilling. So a lot of the baby boomers really have to start saying, we have to start looking at serious carbon taxes. We have to look at repairing some of the damage that's been done, and we have to do it in a radical way. So I'm optimistic that we can make the changes as long as we have the political leadership. And in Canada, we just had a change in government that's taking the problem of climate change very seriously. And so we'll see just whether or not them taking it seriously translates into policy and action. But on the face of it, we're in a very different world right now in Canada, and that bodes well. But I think more or less people do get it now. And one of the things that really changes people's mind is when they see climate change in their own backyard. Right now, where I am in Edmonton in Alberta, we are having an incredibly warm year. And of course, it's not just being warm as an indicator of climate change. It can actually be colder than normal as an indicator of climate change. At least at these latitudes, we have things like the polar vortex. And these sorts of changes aren't what people are used to. And once you push people outside of their sort of what I used to, it really does change people's perceptions. And on the prairies here, we do have a lot of grain farmers, and they talk about drought now, and they're seeing conditions that they've never seen before. In some years, they're seeing fields that are just so wet that they can't plant their crops, and in other years, it's so dry they can't grow them. So, one of the hallmarks of climate change, and one of the things we're really seeing in our polar bear data as well, is that the amount of variation in the climate and in the weather and in the species responses is just so all over the place. Um, it's really clear that we're not in sort of the same sort of scenario that we used to be for a lot of different species. And we see it in polar bears. I mean, we've had several really poor years of polar bear conditions. So how fat the bears were over in Western Hudson Bay in Canada here. And yet last year, the bears were in pretty good shape. But that was a response to the polar vortex that sucked down a lot of cold air from the Arctic. And the bears responded pretty much as we would have expected. But the problem is there, we've got a population that's down by 30 to 40% over the last couple of decades. And one good year doesn't blow you back to where you were. This is a species that grows incredibly slowly, only a few percent per year. So to recover that deficit would be, probably decades away, and we're not going to see ongoing cold conditions. All projections are that that population won't even exist by mid-century.
One of the things you posted on Twitter is a polar bear body condition and a qualitative index from 1 to 5. And it's got a catchy phrase, fat is where it's at. So it sort of marks polar bears from sort of a largish, cuddly looking thing down to almost like a sloth wearing polar bear suit. What sort of things are you seeing at the moment?
Well, it depends. And again, this last year when I was out doing some work with the bears, it was interesting. I mean, I saw one male that was basically right up there with the sort of the 5 out of 5, as fat as a bear really can get at that time of the year. And then right after that, saw a bear that would have been well down on the 2 scale, like really just skinny. And as I mentioned, that is really what drives these animals. And, if a polar bear had its choice, it would never come on land. They would stay out on the sea ice all year round. Um, and the other thing is they would never stop eating. I mean, no polar bear ever looked at its reflection in the little puddle and said, I'm too fat. They just don't do that. They just keep eating and eating and eating. And that's the whole strategy for a bear. Um, and they can eat so much in a good year that sometimes they can actually carry some of that weight forward in future years as well. So they basically have their own, refrigerator with them. It's just packed up inside their fat cells, and that's the energy they take with them. And while they can go long periods of time without food, there are limits to how far you can push them, and it's tied to how much sea ice there is, which is what gives them the access to their prey.
Is there a particular way they eat? I mean, you said before they go for the fat, so they must be very specific when they kill something or what they're looking for. How do they tend to what sort of prey do they have, and how do they go about extracting what they need?
Well, this is exactly the sort of deal for a bear. And if they catch an adult seal, a ring seal could be up to 70 kilos, and a bearded seal up to 400 kilos. But when they get them, it's basically you sort of got to think they're not really interested in the skin, and they're not really interested in the meat. What they really want to eat is that blubber layer that sits in between, and it's kind of what I call the Oreo cookie effect. They're not sort of interested in the top nor the bottom. They just want the middle. And so what they do is they peel open the seals, and then they just scrape the fat out. And a polar bear can eat about 20% of its body mass in a single meal. So if you get a big male polar bear, it could be 500 kilograms, kills a big bearded seal, rips it open, and just scoops out the fat. They could easily take in 100 kilograms of fat over a period of time that they're feeding on it, like could be hours. And from there, out of that 100 kilos, about 94 kilos is going to go directly onto their own body, pretty much unmodified. So it just goes in their stomach, in their bloodstream, deposited into the fat cells. And so, as humans, we fuss about, 1 or 2 meals of excess, too many French fries or something. But for a polar bear, that's really what it is. It's just gorging when the food is there. And you don't need a lot of seals. You don't have to kill a lot of seals to be able to fill up your fat cells. So it's a boom and bust situation for the bears. And most of their feeding occurs during a very small window in the springtime, uh, sort of March, April, May. And it depends on the sea ice conditions at that time of year, will really dictate how that population is doing and whether or not a female will have enough fat to produce cubs, and whether or not individuals will have enough fat to survive the leaner periods of the year, which is pretty much another 9 months of the year when they can sometimes kill seals, but not very often.
And how would a practical expedition work from your point of from say preparation? You said the first thing, I guess, with all science is you ask the question. How do you take it from there to progress?
Well, yeah, the biggest question I think probably for most scientists is, do we have enough money to ask the question? That's always our rub point for polar bear research. It's one of the most expensive types of research for wildlife that we do, because we're so reliant on having helicopters as our baseline of support. Quite often we work with technology like satellite telemetry, so we're putting out collars, GPSs on our bears so we can follow them. Um, But the basic premise is that for understanding an Arctic ecosystem is you need long-term data series. So most of the types of studies in the places where I've been doing my research, we're trying to get a time series so we can detect changes in a population over time. So we're also working sometimes to find new ways to get insights. So are there less invasive methods that we can apply to understanding what the bears are doing? Are there things that we could collect from their hair, for example? So if we can get a hair sample, can we look at things like stress hormones in their hair? We're basically trying to get some early warning tech to tell us that a population might be in trouble. At the same time, to some extent, we're just documenting what's happening to the bears. So, in a lot of our work, we're trying to understand the dynamics, how many cubs are born, how many are surviving, which bears are producing more cubs, which are not. We have, in some of our populations, we have a very in-depth pedigree of the population as well. So we've had over the last 40 years, several thousand polar bears go through various research programs, and each one of them have had a DNA sample collected. So now we can start to look at um, pedigree. So which bears are producing more cubs and which bears are actually surviving better. And then within that, we're also trying to look at which genes might be being expressed under changing environmental conditions in these different populations. So a lot of the questions that we ask are sometimes post hoc. We never thought about this, but we collected the samples and we can look at the issue because we have large freezers full of tissues that we've collected over the years. But very often we go out with a dedicated question, and one of the burning ones we have right now is, we talk about habitat loss. How much is too much for a bear before we'll start to see a population come undone. And so that's one of the driving things that we're working with and trying to combine different methodologies. So we use sea ice modeling, we use remote sensing, we use energetic modeling, we use population modeling as well to try to get some sense of where these populations are particularly vulnerable.
How have you found the governments in that region stepping up to the plate with things like breeding programs? Are polar bears receptive to something like that?
In terms of breeding polar bears in the wild or
Uh,
for in captivity for release in the wild,
yeah, or either just breeding in general.
terms of sort of the interventionist side, um, we're not really at that stage for the most part. For most polar bear populations, we're still relying on natural recruitment into the population to maintain the numbers. The problem is um, we're not set up to deal with polar bears for the most part from a captive scenario. So there's very little that we can expect from zoos in the short term. In the longer term, we may be actually looking to zoos as sort of a genetic repository for trying to maintain some of the diversity in wild populations. And one of the problems we've got with polar bears is they're not very genetically diverse. So if we end up with very few individuals left in the wild, very quickly we could see negative implications from inbreeding, depression, things like that. So there's quite a lot of reluctance in the north right now, I would say, to sort of look that far ahead. A few years ago, myself and several colleagues looked at what some of our potential uh, action could be to deal with climate change. So, would we move bears from the south to areas further north? That would have benefits of taking them from a place where they're no longer able to thrive and also increasing genetic diversity in the north. Would we just shoot bears that were too sick or starving? Nobody wants to see an animal suffer, but there's no policies in place or programs in place to say, well, look, that bear's not going to live. Let's just put it out of its misery. Would we feed bears? Would we go out and actually create large piles of bear food to try to get some of these populations through very lean times? So we're not at that stage yet. And there is a fair bit of reluctance from some governments to sort of start to ponder some of those issues. I think when we get a little further down the road here and where we start to see more population